Welcome to The Politics Guys, a place for a bipartisan, rational, and civil debate on American politics and policy. I'm Michael Baranowski, a political scientist at Northern Kentucky University. With me today is my regular co-host, Cleveland area attorney and Republican factotum, Jay Carson.
Good morning.
Hey, Jay, how are you doing?
I'm good. I'm had a nice vacation
Tan, rested, and ready.
and
Yeah,
rested and ready, as
as
they
they,
as your Nixon t-shirt used to say.
yeah, back in the day, I did have one of those shirts. God, another lifetime. Well, it is, of course, you came back at a great time for a huge story, which obviously we'll open with this week, the story that dominated the news, certainly. And that, of course, is the summit between Donald Trump and Russian President Vladimir Putin in Helsinki, Finland. And, by almost all accounts, I'd say you could say it was at best a weak performance by President Trump, who I would say, most people I think would say, came off as far less powerful and commanding than he did during, say, the NATO summit the week before. And most people seem to agree, I certainly do, that the low point was during that post-summit joint press conference with Putin, where President Trump seemed to say that he trusted Putin's denials of Russian tampering in the 2016 elections more than he did the assessment of the U.S. intelligence community, which, of course, has concluded that Russia absolutely did interfere with our 2016 elections. Now, of course, after that, the White
Well,
House.
I differ you with a little bit on the what we talk about what the Russians did and didn't do. But to your point, everything else, yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
And I think to call that a low point is to sort of um, uh, that's sort of underselling it.
Okay, well, yeah, I was giving it the most generous spin, but yeah, we'll get into that in a minute because you posted a great article on our Facebook page this week from George Will, I believe it was, that was, I think, kind of hit a lot of those notes. But anyway, so throughout the rest of the week, of course, the White House and the president himself tried various ways of backpedaling and explaining, including that ludicrous claim from the president, was it that when he said, he, meaning President Putin, just said it's not Russia. I will say this. I don't see any reason why it would be. That he actually meant to say, I don't see any reason why it wouldn't be.
Right.
Okay.
It
And
happened to anybody.
yeah, oh, sure, certainly. And then later in the week, the White House announced that President Trump had invited Putin to Washington this fall for a second summit. And then there were also a number of House and Senate votes and non-votes on various things, with, I'd say, the upshot being that nothing truly substantive came out of Congress as a result of this. Now that's kind of the optics and the press conferencing. Now, in terms of substance, there were no formal agreements reached between the two leaders, though Russian officials claimed that there were some verbal agreements on things like Syria and nuclear arms limitation agreements, but because only, Presidents Putin, Trump, and their interpreters were in the room, well, there's no actual independent confirmation of any of this. So, Jay, I wanted to get your take. What did you think about the President Trump's, I guess I'll call it, performance in Helsinki?
Well, this has been, I'll tell you, it's a bizarre story, and I'll tell you, this has really made me think on a whole lot of different levels, because there were a whole lot of things that went wrong here. But starting with Trump, and really here's the thing, the only piece that we really saw of this was that sort of bizarre press conference.
Yeah.
Where there wasn't really any discussion of anything other than Trump's claims that, well, 4 hours ago, U.S. relations with Russia were an all-time low. Now they're terrific. And then, wandering into the bizarre bit about, he said it wasn't the Russians, don't know why it would be. So to me, and this is, and I think to other conservatives, there was sort of a question of going at the very outset of, well, what exactly is this summit about? Why do we need it? What are we doing? I mean, you ought to have some sort of an agenda going into a summit of we're meeting to discuss whatever, Syria, or nuclear arms, or the Russians cheating on the INF, or any variety of things. But it seemed more just of a Trump-Putin hanging out for a while.
Right.
So I guess that troubles me a
Well,
little bit as to
to that
I'm
point,
not sure what we're expecting. Yeah.
well, to that point, that reminds me in a way a bit of the Trump Kim summit, because most of these things, of course, there's a lot of spade work done in advance by lower level people, so that you get out
Yeah.
of the summit, you're sure to get what they call deliverables, some sort of agreement on something. But that clearly is not how Donald Trump wants to operate. He just wants to go in there first and see what happens after, which is sort of going against, well, generations or more of diplomatic best practice. And there's a reason why it's best practice, you know?
Yeah. Well, and I think you could even make the differentiation between Kim, which was in some ways, again, a diplomatic opening that
Sure.
really hadn't occurred ever before, as opposed to summits with the Russians or slash Soviet Union, which we've got a pretty clear blueprint for,
Yeah, that's
which
correct.
we've been doing for years. Yeah. Um,
So,
but the yeah, and I guess you can I guess move on to the next question. Um, I would say that what Trump did was embarrassing. It was bizarre. I don't think it's treasonous, as some people have called, but
well,
it's one of those.
when you compare his manner, his demeanor, his bearing at the NATO summit with how he acted toward Putin, he just seemed cowed and scared and so just craven in his willingness to just reach out to this murderous, awful man, you know.
Yeah,
And yet, when it comes to democratic allies, and let's not kid ourselves, Russia is not a democratic government; it's an authoritarian regime, a murderous kind of thugocracy led by this, former CIA operative or CIA KGB operative. Yeah,
KGB. Yeah,
it just is. I can understand why people would say, well, you look at all this, and then he makes this bizarre comment to Tucker Carlson that, well, I wouldn't go to war over Montenegro, even if they are a NATO ally. And you put all this together, and it becomes increasingly hard for more and more people to say, well, geez, this is the way somebody who is in fear of having some dirt on him released acts. In fact, just the editor in chief of Political came out saying that I used to be a Trump skeptic in this sense, on this issue, but now I'm thinking that Putin must have something on him. And all these things come together, and it becomes increasingly more difficult to understand what other reason there could be for this bizarre behavior.
my sense is again, I don't jump to the collusion conclusion. Immediately.
Sure.
Let's. I would say that the Political article, the way that was spelled out, I think was well done, and I think it presents a plausible case. And again, that case isn't necessarily for collusion as it's been described here. That there is a quid pro quo.
Right. More of a
Actually,
blackmail thing, really. It felt like
yeah,
to
more
me,
or more of just a hey, I want to tread carefully because I don't know what these guys have.
Yeah.
Type thing.
The, the idea that the president feels that he is somehow compromised.
Yeah.
Which is not what you want, certainly.
Right. Not what you want. My sense is, though, that there are a lot of other reasons that and my sense, it's kind of like he sort of seems to treat his friends more badly than his enemies or potential enemies, and I think that goes across the board. I mean, he would trash all sorts of Republican senators, and then sit down with his friends Chuck and Nancy.
Or
he would trash his NATO allies, and to say trash. I don't want to overstate, because I think what you said earlier about his performance at the NATO conference, albeit in some ways undiplomatic, it's I don't think that it's wrong to he's not wrong on the merits of a lot of what he talked about at NATO as far as contributions from the other countries and so forth. But it's almost like you can get away with treating your friends and family pretty crummy, but you have to be polite when dealing with outsiders, and I think that's maybe the way he looks at it, or more, maybe more apt. This sort of I thought, and again, this is armchair psychology, so take it for what it's worth. Is that he views sort of the Republicans in Congress or NATO allies, or like those are sort of like Trump employees. You know what I mean? You can, they're my guys. I can say what I want about them and tell. But when I'm dealing with someone else, I'm going to be more circumspect. Maybe it was some sort of bizarre not wanting to, thinking he's being more diplomatic by not calling out Putin on the election stuff. I don't know, but suffice it to say, I still think it's bizarre, embarrassing, a show of weakness when we need to show strength. And also, it's one of those. It's almost. It goes back to like the David Duke endorsement or the Charlottesville thing, where probably one of the easiest, probably the second easiest layup in American political politics after condemning the Klan or racism is beating up on the Russians. I mean, that's sort of like the and it's you will suffer no political downside in being tough with Russia, and so again, it's
Well, my sort of armchair psychology sort of thing makes me wonder that, you're familiar, I'm sure, with the term wannabes, right? People who, and so, I mean, as a Marine, I've encountered a few sort of military, you could say, wannabes, people who get all gung ho and so forth, and I would have joined up, but I had this hangnail or whatever it is, that kind of thing, and it seems to me that President Trump has this huge attraction to strong people, whether it's authoritarian dictators or whether it's all the generals he likes to surround himself with and so forth. And to me, there's a feeling like here's a person who realizes that he's fundamentally weak, but he's drawn to this strength that he doesn't have. And that could just be total BS on my part, but that's kind of and again, it gets back to my fundamental belief that Donald Trump is a weak, scared, fundamentally insecure person, which is exactly the sort of thing you don't want in the leader of the free world. But there you go. So
no, and I think that's a much more plausible explanation than they've got something on them.
Yeah.
For other reasons that I would could go into, as far as if the Russians really did have something to blackmail Trump with. And the political piece suggests, it's not, salacious sex stuff, because that's sort of been factored in the equation already with Trump. But there'd be some kind of shady money laundering type stuff, tax evasion, Manafort type stuff. Yeah. Again, I think that if they really had that, I think the Russians would have played their hand a little stronger, and done more to push the Trump election than what they did. I mean, we're getting sort of getting into that sort of intelligence, counterintelligence, wheels within wheels type thing, and you could drive yourself crazy saying, but yes, that's exactly what they'd want you to think. So that so
sure. Well, I should mention, we've both talked a little bit about that political piece, and listeners, I will put that in the show notes if you haven't had a chance to look at that yet. But another part of this I want to talk about is, President Trump this week said that he does accept that the Russians interfered in the 2016 elections. But what's interesting to me is how divided ideologically the public is on this issue. There was a CBS News poll that came out this week, found that 70% of Americans agree with the conclusions of U.S. intelligence about Russian meddling in the elections. But there's a fascinating Republican-Democrat split. Only 51% of Republicans agree, and 42% say they don't believe the Russians interfered, and the rest are unsure. On the other side of things, 89% of Democrats believe the Russians interfered with, while only 8% don't buy it. And I think, to me, that's what happens when the leader of your party decides to essentially try to discredit the intelligence services in the service of his personal agenda. And I think this is the kind of destruction in terms of faith in institutions that he has wrought. And it's exactly, I would argue, the sort of things that the Russians were hoping for.
Yeah, no, I think the Russians achieved their objective, which to me was not, and again, to me, but it wasn't to meddle in an election to elect Donald Trump, but was to just sow the seeds of discord in the U.S., to undermine trust in institutions, and that sort of thing, which is something that the Russians and the Soviets before them have been doing for forever. So some on the right have noted, that there's the hypocrisy of the left chiming in now as far as, oh my gosh, the Russian threat. And to me, hypocrisy is sometimes a good argument, but it doesn't mean that they're wrong.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Yeah, yeah.
The folks on the left who are now condemning Russia are now correct. They should have been condemning them for years and years and years. And I was thinking back, there was a great book written in the mid '90s, and I'm forgetting the author right now. I could run and go look because it's on my bookshelf. But Inside the KGB. And it was about sort of everything, the KGB's foreign operations in the U.S. and all these sorts of things that they had done, which were of the variety of like the Facebook posts and just the sowing discord and just screwing with us, sponsoring leftist groups and marches for one thing or another. And I have great stories about even, this church program that our church happened to be involved in. And I swore at the time when I was 14, this is a commie plot. And it turns out that, 15 years later, as the, records became known after the fall of the Soviet Union, it was a commie plot. This kind of thing has been happening for years. I to the folks who are on the left who are upset about it, I say, welcome to the club. But I think to that poll, maybe it's the question of interfered with the election, because still that phraseology troubles me a little bit, because there were a lot of things that the Russians were doing.
But no, well, just hold on 1 second. I just want to make it clear that you're going to, make these comments, but I just want to make it clear that the conclusion of the intelligence community was that the Russians interfered with the election process. And we're not talking just about the Facebook posts and all that. We're talking about trying to hack into elections-related systems in a number of states. We're talking about, kind of direct attempts at direct interference. And also, the intelligence community concluded that they interfered not just to disrupt the elections and so, mistrust, but they did so also with the idea of favoring Donald Trump over Hillary Clinton. Now, you can differ with that, but if you do, anyone who does is going against what the conclusions of our intelligence community were. Right,
and I'm not differing with that.
Okay, I just wanted to make that clear.
Yeah, make clear. But to say they interfered successfully, I guess. There's no doubt fair. There's no doubt they attempted to hack into various state electoral systems. And I think the intelligence community assessment is that in most cases, these were sort of trial runs to see what they could break into, what they could get, what they couldn't. But there was no actual, changing votes, that sort of thing, hacking the actual electoral system. And then with the Facebook post, again, to me, that from what the intelligence assessment, says, it began as sow discord and evolved into elect Trump, which to me also is sort of in the same category of sow discord. The third category, I think, where you look at what the Russians were doing was the hacking of the DNC, where, again, in this case, they did actually break into the DNC's computer network and got a lot of information and subsequently released it to the disadvantage of Hillary Clinton. Although to say Trump got an advantage out of that, it's more Bernie Sanders, if anyone was advantaged by it. But that said, I think when the question is asked, do you believe the Russians interfered in the election? I think there might be a better question of, do you believe the Russians attempted to interfere in the election? So that's, I don't mean to quibble on that, but I'm just saying, when you say that there's a public disconnect, that they don't believe this, I don't think that the public doesn't believe it. But to me, there's sort of a conflation of they're doing some stuff, and did they elect Trump, which is something completely different.
I think you're.
To say that here's the thing. I think the Democratic narrative is, but for the Russians, Hillary Clinton would be president.
Well, no, I'll
And I don't think
disagree.
that's at all
Hold on,
accurate.
I'll disagree with that. I think that there are some on the left who say that, but to call it the Democratic narrative is overreaching. I mean, I think that the American narrative should be that regardless of how successful the Russians were, the very fact that they even made any sort of broad scale attempt to interfere in our elections calls for the strongest pushback. And
I don't know about the strongest pushback.
well, I would say, I mean, this strikes at the heart of our democracy, and that's what's the most
Well, okay.
that's the most disappointing thing to me of all this is that we've done far too little to prepare ourselves for 2018. I mean, let me just say that, get on my soapbox here a little bit, but obviously the decentralized nature of our system with all the individual state election systems that provides some protection, and it's fair to say that now in 2018 coming up, voting officials are a lot more aware of potential threats, and so they're going to be a lot less likely to fall for that kind of click on this link, spear phishing type scams. Right. But there's still a lot we haven't done. For instance, there are still 13 states that use paperless voting machines, meaning that, there's no obviously paper trail in case of suspected hacking. Yep. Our voter registration and other systems still need a lot of work in terms of security. I mean, the intelligence community reached these conclusions about Russia in December of 2016. It took until May of 2018 for Congress to appropriate any funds to strengthen election security. And that the money they
but that was a bigger.
But still, they could have done something.
Election security specifically.
They could have done something. But my point is, they could have done a special appropriation for that, and they chose not to do that. And that $380 million they appropriated, it's only now getting to states, which means that even if Congress had approved more funding, and which was something they talked about this week and wasn't done, and Republicans in Congress just said we're not going to do this. Even if they had, it would be difficult for it to have had a positive effect on election security before November of this year, just because of how long it takes to roll all this stuff out. It's not like you can say, oh, if people are wondering, it's not like you say, oh, here's this new super secure machine. Boom, we're just going to plan it down, a week before and you're good to go. I mean, this stuff takes months and months and months. And a lot of this stuff is training and other things. So there's a lot of lead time involved. And so for me, what's just unconscionable, really, is that we haven't done a lot more, a lot quicker. It would seem to me that this is a bipartisan issue, that after we knew that the Russians had made these attempts, that the first thing Republicans and Democrats should have gotten together on is saying, we're going to appropriate whatever it takes to make sure that this does not happen again. And that didn't happen. And that's a disgrace.
I agree with all of that.
Cool. Well, there you go. All right.
There you go.
That's good.
No, my disagreement, I guess, would be when you say that. First, let me step back. Absolutely, Trump should have responded strongly to the Russians, and again, he missed this easy political layup, I think, in saying to Putin or at the press conference that the U.S. will not tolerate any hacking into our systems. Even if it's into Crooked Hillary's ill-secured server. I mean, that kind of thing. I mean, he could have had it both ways.
To me, based on all of this now,
Democrats, Republicans, whatever, we're not going to stand for this this sort of thing from a foreign country. And again, he didn't say that, and it's bizarre that he didn't.
Well, to me, it's no longer bizarre. To me, I've come to the conclusion that the simplest explanation for all this, really, after all my skepticism, I'm with the editor-in-chief of Politico. I think that the reasonable conclusion to reach at this point is that President Trump is compromised by the Russians, and that is a truly awful thing.
Well, see, here I thought you were going just a couple minutes ago with the he just has a fetish for strongmen.
Well, no, I think he does have a fetish for strong men, but I think that I think that's certainly part of it, but I think that ultimately just looking at all of his behavior and all of the things we've seen in regards to Russia compared to everyone else in particular, that to me, the most the simplest, most straightforward conclusion that explains the most things is that he either is actually compromised or he believes himself to be compromised by Vladimir Putin.
Okay.
So there we go.
All right.
All right. Well, let's move on to. There were other things that went on this week. Believe it or
I could go on
not.
a whole other hour on this.
Oh yeah, absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah.
You know, Jay, for years, congressional Republicans have wanted to pass legislation. Well, I'd say weakening the Endangered Species Act. You'd say
reforming.
Yeah, reforming the Endangered Species Act. But of course, to this point, they haven't had the votes to do that, and they still don't. But this week, the Interior Department gave them a big helping hand by proposing a pretty sweeping set of rule changes to the act. Just to give you a sense, among the proposed changes are those that would weaken protections for threatened species. That's the level just below endangered. They would remove a rule that instructs agencies to not consider economic impact when determining whether wildlife should be protected. And it would remove a requirement that agencies consult with scientists and wildlife agencies before they approve permits for things like oil and gas drilling or logging. So, Jay, I guess before I kind of give my opinion on this, you can probably get a sense of what it is. What do you think about this?
I think, well, first of all, if you live by administrative agencies, you die by administrative agencies. That'd be my first observation on this. Secondly, some of these rules I think are not unreasonable. Others more so, and it would depend on what actually happens moving forward. But in many cases, I mean, the Endangered Species Act has been successful for lots and lots of species, and we've been able to remove them from the list as they've flourished. Part that bothers, I think, most Republicans. I don't know, not most Republicans, but a lot of folks on the right are these things like you can't take into account economic factors because look, life is about hard choices, and when it comes down to things like a snail darter versus thousands of jobs, I think it's entirely appropriate that.
First they came for the snail darters, then they came for the wolves, then that's my concern.
Well, but look, I think this is about making hard choices, and I don't think it's inappropriate to weigh economic factors into those choices.
I think there are two issues here for me. One issue is the difficulty or the extraordinarily long, in years, oftentimes time frame to get all the necessary environmental permits and clearances before going ahead with the project. And I totally agree that is a huge problem, and that process needs to be dramatically streamlined, and there are ways to do that. So I think on that, you and I are totally in agreement.
Yes.
Here's where I disagree. The way to do that is not this approach. There's this myth out there that the Endangered Species Act has been a success and we've done all these great things, but actually we've had a lot more animals or wildlife go on the threatened and endangered list than come off. Just to give folks a sense. No, just to give folks a sense, the natural, what scientists call the background rate of extinction, which happens in nature, it's around somewhere they think between 1 to 5 species per year. Now, currently, the best estimates are that we're losing species at somewhere between 1,000 to 10,000 times that rate. So dozens of species going extinct every single day. Well, let me finish, and then you can go ahead and comment. But the problem is that we're not spending enough on this. There's one study done by the Center for Biological Diversity concluded that the federal government spends only around 3.5% of what's needed for recovery of endangered species. And what that means in dollar terms, currently we're spending around $82 million per year, which is a pittance when it comes to the federal budget. And according to the center, somewhere around $2.3 billion a year is needed. And to kind of put that in perspective, that's around what a single B-2 stealth bomber cost, or 0.1% of what the Republican tax cut is expected to cost over the next decade. And so to me, the problem isn't that we're doing too much. The problem is that we're doing far, far, far too little.
What's the money needed for? What's it going to go to?
Well, basically for various efforts to, I think they call it rehabilitate species on the endangered list.
Okay. And so I'd repeat my question. What exactly would the money go to?
Well, I think there are various things they can do in terms of breeding programs and other things to increase the populations. But in terms of exactly how that works, I couldn't tell you because I don't have the background for that.
Right. No, I get. But here's the thing. Just setting aside the numbers, to me, the endangered species isn't so much about or at least the problems that people see with it. The reasons for these rule changes doesn't have to do with how much money we're spending on it or not spending on it. It's to the prohibitory pieces, saying somebody wants to build something in this place, but you have to go through the process and you realize that it is habitat for some endangered species, so that a project is either shelved sort of indefinitely while there is, this works through the process for years and years and years, or it's shelved permanently. That is the argument that I think most conservatives have against the Endangered Species Act. Is not particularly with how much funding goes towards it, because again, it's more an issue of prohibition rather than spending. But let's say you want to spend more money on it, great. Also, sometimes I think we need to reflect on this is the U.S. Endangered Species Act, and species may be going extinct at an alarming rate worldwide, but unfortunately, we don't have jurisdiction over a lot of these places where these species are becoming extinct. In prepping for the show, I thought this was kind of funny. I pulled up some internet articles reading about this, and I can't tell you like how many of these pieces, with the headline of Trump. The best one was these 10 species will become extinct under the new Trump rules, which is I think pretty funny. But again, they included things like African elephants, and which the African elephant has yet to establish a foothold here in Ohio.
No, I get what you're saying, and
I mean it's sure. The alarm stuff, and it's pictures of polar bears, and yes, we've got some polar bears in Alaska, but most of the polar bears in the world don't live here.
Yeah,
and
these
right. And these pieces that we're talking about of hey, can I build this here? Can I drill here? Can I do this economic activity in this place? In most cases, don't relate to the hundreds of species that are going extinct in the rainforest. Now, look, there's other stuff we can do in terms of incentives, disincentives, in dealing with those other countries to preserve stuff that they have. But in this case, when we're talking about does this prevent an unreasonable impediment to economic activity here in the U.S.? I mean, to me, that's what so much of these changes were looking at.
Well, you're right. Certainly, that hard choices need to be made, and I think that for decades now, we've been making those hard choices in the wrong way. I think certainly I understand the argument about economic growth, and I think economic growth is very important. But I also think when you get species going extinct, and in the U.S., and certainly not polar bears in the U.S. or anything like that, but and most of these species are not cute, cuddly, photogenic things. They're small things you'd never notice or see.
But some other species eats them, and some other species eats them, and yes.
Exactly. Yeah. And so once a lot of these things start going distinct, you get these, because this is a complex system, an interconnected system, you get these changes that you can't possibly know the final results of, though certainly you ask a biologist and they say, well, this is just not a good thing even a little bit. And so I think that we're weighing this in entirely the wrong way. I would totally be in favor of putting a ton of resources into making the permitting process as quick and efficient as possible, because I do think it's wrong that you have to wait years and years and years, and part of that's a resource problem. But once a species is listed as endangered, I agree. You shouldn't be allowed. The current rule is that you can't import, export, capture, kill, transport, or sell any species that's endangered. And I think that's exactly as it should be. And so my argument is that we should actually strengthen this in terms of giving the relevant bodies more resources to not just enforce this in certain ways, but also to get through the permitting process and give a yay or a nay vote as quickly as possible. But I'm not in favor of making it more likely to go ahead with these projects if they're going to destroy habitats of endangered species. Not at all.
All right. Well,
Okay.
fair enough. And I think we're really probably more in agreement on this than it seems.
At
I
least
mean,
on
if you're
certain
okay,
parts,
yeah.
yeah. Okay, before we get to our next story, we'd like to thank our newest supporters. First is Evan, who's been a supporter for a while, actually. He recently increased his monthly support of the show on Patreon. And that when people do that, it kind of says to me that they not only think that what we're doing is worth supporting, but even after they made that decision, I feel like they're saying, well, it's actually supporting even more, which is it's pretty cool.
We should get extra points for that.
Absolutely,
After that, yeah.
So,
or it's the triumph of hope over experience. Thank you, Evan.
Yeah. And next is Nancy, who's our newest Patreon monthly sustaining supporter. She wrote, "Thank you for the podcast. I like hearing sensible discussion from someone who is not on my side. I consider myself to be a progressive with a centrist bent. I've tried to find podcasts from the right I can stand to listen to, but I haven't had much success." I know what you mean, Nancy. She writes, I enjoyed Mike Murphy's Radio Free GOP before he went radio silent after the election. Ben Shapiro and the Washington Free Beacon, Matthew Continetti aside, podcasts are just too abrasive for me to handle. Do you have any recommendations? So I guess that's really a question to me, Jay, since you're not,
Right. I really don't listen to many podcasts.
But I do have actually 3 suggestions, both for you, Nancy, and for anyone else who is interested and find some of the kind of red meat podcasts a bit much. There's one from the Weekly Standard called The Daily Standard. It's short and oftentimes very interesting, I think. National Review has a bevy of podcasts. Some of them are pretty good. Some of them, I can take or leave them, but there's some pretty good. And
Jonah Goldberg has one, The Remnant.
Yep,
yeah,
absolutely. And finally, the Wall Street Journal has a podcast called Potomac Watch, which I think is pretty good. So those would be my recommendations if you haven't had a whole lot of luck finding views from the right that you don't find to be kind of too abrasive, I guess, for your taste. So there you go.
I'd add, again, this isn't a podcast, but TV show, is the Wall Street Journal editorial report. What do they call it? It's on Fox, but it's essentially their editors of the editorial page sit around to talk about stuff.
Oh, okay.
So again, it's certainly right leaning, but it's not of the red meat sort of build a wall, throw them out kind of discussion.
All right, well, there you go. So I hope those recommendations are useful. And I should mention, of course, when you become a supporter of the show, you not only help keep us going, which is a pretty big deal, but you also get access to our special supporters only after show. Last week, Trey and I talked about the Jim Jordan, Ohio State University sexual assault thing and the politics behind and the wisdom of, I guess, President Trump's pardons that he made last week. And this week, we also have some pretty good stuff lined up for you as well. And again, if you want to support the show, you know how to do it. Well, I hope you know how to do it at this point. politicsguys.com/support. That's a direct link. Or you can go to politicsguys.com and you'll see support the show and the Patreon and PayPal links, and you can click on those. And we really do appreciate it. Thank you so much. All right, moving on. This week, Google was hit by the European Union with a equivalent to $5 billion US fine for anti-competitive behavior, specifically bundling its apps on Android and then requiring phone manufacturers to set them as defaults for users. And if they don't do that, then they could lose access to Google's App Store. Antitrust regulators in the U.S. actually considered taking a similar action against Google back in 2013, but they decided against that. Now, President Trump slammed the EU's ruling. He tweeted, "I told you so. The European Union, the European Union just slapped a $5 billion fine on one of our great companies, Google. They truly have taken advantage of the U.S., but not for long." Now this comes, I should point out, after another EU fine of Google earlier, again for anti-competitive behavior. This one was for the equivalent of $2.7 billion. Now, Google is still appealing that fine. It says it's going to appeal this one as well. And you might think, come on, 5 billion, 2.7.
A lot of billions, actually.
Well, but for Google, you might think those are small numbers. But I should point out that this latest fine also includes a provision that Google must implement those remedies that the European Commission suggested, and also end these practices they deem to be illegal within 90 days, or they face penalty payments of 5% of their global daily revenue for each day they're not in compliance. And that can really add up, I would say, certainly. And my view on all this is, I think, very much in line with Democratic Senator Richard Blumenthal. And he commented that the FTC should end its decade of inaction and deference and confront the mounting evidence that Google's business practices have stifled robust competition in a market that is critical to our economy and society. Europe should not be alone in setting the agenda. And I couldn't have said it any better than that. Jay, what do you think?
Well, I agree on the Europe shouldn't be alone in setting the agenda piece of it.
Well, there you go. Okay.
I don't know about. I like his prescription that the FTC ought to become more involved. This is reminiscent of the 1990s antitrust case against Microsoft.
Yeah, absolutely.
Where they bundled a browser, essentially the Netscape browser, I believe.
No, the Internet Explorer.
No, I thought it was Netscape.
It was Netscape Internet Explorer, and the problem was that, of course, that it just achieved this huge market dominance, and it was a crummy browser, and other browsers like what became the Firefox browser couldn't get any headroom because of that.
But of course, they ended that essentially through there was a fine against them, but then there was a settlement and consent decree and all that. I don't recall the details. But the gist of it is, if you want to include, products with your product that are helpful, you do so at your own peril, and I think that's a bad way to go. To me, I think that this is going to have the effect of raising prices on smartphones in Europe. Assuming Google even wants to stay in that business at this point. I think the EU is wrong on gets wrong on the facts in that. Look, you have this is not a captive app market. You can go to the App Store anywhere. You can download whatever browser you want. It's not. Even less so than in the age of the Microsoft case, a situation where you've got a tying arrangement that sort of it binds you to some other product that you don't want to buy. So I think the EU gets it wrong. I think it's largely.
I think you get it entirely wrong here. I mean, I think the power of defaults is huge for a lot of ways. And, for instance, what happened when Microsoft was forced to not have Internet Explorer set as default? Well, if you look at the browser market share right now, Microsoft's browsers have 15, 16%. They can't compete in a free and fair market. And that's what Google is, essentially doing. And, I've said it time and time again. I think one of the fundamental roles, one of the main ways that government should be involved in the economy is not through direct regulation wherever they can avoid it, because I don't think that's very efficient or effective. But what I do think is effective is ensuring that there is a competitive playing field for these things. And in many of these cases, when companies don't do that, like Microsoft in the 90s or like Google today, they need to be punished for doing that, And so I think that the government's role in enhancing competition is critically important. And so I think the EU got it exactly right here, and that the FTC should have stepped in.
Well, you wouldn't disagree, though, that you have a wide choice, really, in, first of all, cell phone manufacturers.
But that doesn't matter, because
cell phone operating systems.
No, you don't, actually. That's just not true.
Let's say you have two operating systems.
Yes.
But there's a choice, and there is robust competition between those two choices.
Well, yeah. There are two competitors in the operating system, but basically, if you don't want to go into Apple's walled garden sort of experience, then
Mhm.
you only really have one real choice, essentially, and that's Android.
That's like, I mean, I guess,
Are you
well, but
familiar with the term duopoly, Jay?
yes, I
Okay.
am. But in some cases,
So would you
what you get
say,
is a natural
but
duopoly.
would you say it's a free and open choice when there's basically one phone and operating system that is very high end that many people simply cannot afford? And so for the vast bulk of people, you only have one choice. Now, I know you can afford any phone you want, but there are a lot of people who simply don't have that option. And so in many cases, Android is your option. And so that's why I think that this is absolutely anti-competitive behavior.
All right, well, let's say, and in that case, then they're focusing on the wrong target. They shouldn't be focusing on Google. They should be focusing on Android. But if you go to the next level, then on your phone, whatever operating system you're running, you can go to an app store and you can download
I agree.
typically for free any number of browsers or other search type apps.
Sure.
I've got a bunch of different ones on my phone actually. Mine came with uh, Safari installed, which I don't really care for. So believe it or not, I download the Google app, and that's what I typically use for searching.
Once again, Jay, you are assuming people are like you, and they're not like you. And you're unique in a lot of
they're
ways.
no, of course
You're
they're
more
like me.
no, you're this is what I call a libertarian fundamental error.
My monumental intelligence and sophistication set aside.
But you
You
can't
still
set that aside, Jay.
yes, you
That's the
can.
point. No, you
When the
can't.
question is, you open up your phone and you say, you know, this browser doesn't seem to work for me. Hey, if I click two buttons, I can get a different one for free. It's hard to see why that is a
Well, more than
yeah,
browser, a bigger part of it is search engine, because that, of course, is where Google gets the
sure.
bulk of it. And so that's really more
But
of
in
the
most
issue.
cases, your browser and search engine are combined in the
Right.
same
So
program.
that's the larger point, and that Google, of course, has just a stranglehold on that search market, and that's what understandably they want that because that's what they use to generate, the vast bulk of their revenues essentially. So, and again, when I say about the libertarian error, what I mean is that I think that in many cases that libertarians are right in that if most people thought like them and were like them and analyzed things like them, that libertarianism would work on a larger level. But that's not how people are. We know that for for an absolute fact, and so therefore it's destined to fail. And so I think that's the fundamental error that you make is that people are going to say, oh, well, this search engine isn't really working for me in a certain way, or I think it's giving me results that are suboptimal, and so therefore I will try another option. That's just not how most real people think in the world. You
Okay, I thought they did, but
no, not at all. I
again,
would say
I'm
you're weird. I mean, in a good way,
right.
But anyway, all right. I want to move on and talk about a major judicial confirmation this week, which sort of, well, it hit the rocks. Senate Republicans realized that they didn't have the votes to confirm Ryan Bounds to the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. Now this came after several Republican senators expressed some concern over some of Bounds' writings when he was a student at Stanford. Like there was this column on LGBT students with the title "Lo, a pestilence stalks us," which, okay. Now, Bounds has since apologized for those columns. He said that they are not in keeping with how I have lived my life. Now, to me here, the most interesting thing about all of this, and the most important thing about all this, well, I don't know the most important, but certainly important, is that Bounds was even up for a vote. Now, there's this, Jay, you're familiar with this, I know. There's this long-standing blue slip tradition in the Senate.
Right. Which has been more or less abolished.
Yeah, because basically for listeners,
I thought it'd been actually officially abolished, hadn't it?
No, I don't. Not that I'm aware of. But anyway, just for listeners who don't know, the idea is that if any senator in a judicial nominee state objects to their appointment, they can basically quash the nomination, essentially. And in this case, both senators in Oregon objected to it. But Mitch McConnell, that supposed lover and defender of Senate tradition, seems to be completely fine with destroying this tradition in the name of political expediency. And
I thought it had already been destroyed, but we'll check on that.
Anyway, it was anyways under Mitch McConnell. But I think the larger point here is it's been working. from a political expediency point. I mean, at this point in his presidency, Donald Trump has had 23 of his judges confirmed, which is a record for anyone at the similar point in their presidency. Now, I would say that certainly the ending the blue slip is a big part of it, but another big part, I would argue even a much bigger part, is something that sort of ironically happened when the Democrats were in charge in November of 2013. The Democrats ended the filibuster for non-Supreme Court judicial nominees, which means that Donald Trump is the first president to go into office needing only 51 votes to confirm nominees, as opposed to the 60, essentially, that presidents oftentimes needed prior to November of 2013. So I think that's really the thing that more than anything else is driving this rapid pace of confirmations. And certainly, that's what the Democrats wanted when they changed this, and they got it for a few years of Obama. And I think their hope was that they would get it under a President Clinton or someone else like that. But hey, if it works for one president, it works for the other party's president too. And so in this case, I think it's sort of a chickens coming home to roost sort of thing. I don't think the filibuster should have been ended at all for either, for these nominees. And now this is the unfortunate results of yet another procedure between the filibuster and the blue slip that was intended to reinforce kind of a bipartisanship that in the name of this kind of partisan polarization and warfare that was done away with. And now we're suffering the results of it. And I think it's a bad development. Jay, what do you think?
I'd agree with you on most of that. The blue slip thing, although I think to the extent it hasn't been abolished already, I think it ought to be. Because it's to me extremely anti-democratic and doesn't serve, I don't think, a useful purpose anymore, and doesn't serve the purpose that it was originally put in to serve, and that is guarding against corruption. When you had for example, back in the day when everyone was more familiar with everyone else, and you'd have some judge coming out of a state, and maybe that state senator knew a little bit more about the judge or judicial nominee, and could step in and discuss on rather their fitness for the office, rather than just a straight line ideological, because it had become sort of partisans would exercise a blue slip on pretty much anyone from the other party, and I think at that point it's no longer doing its job. But I think the other thing to look at is.
But before I get to that, can you? Because I actually think you make a fairly good case about the blue sometimes about the blue slip. But what about the filibuster element? I was hoping you could kind of comment on that.
The filibuster. I'm more again, as a traditionalist, I think it's sad that it went away, and I think we might be better served if we still had that rule.
Okay,
but. It's happened. There's nothing in the Constitution that requires it, certainly.
And it's not coming back. I mean,
simply as a matter of tradition. I don't see it coming back anytime in the near future. You'd have to have some really monumental sea change in terms of how we look at these things for it to come back. But no, I agree. I think we were in some ways better off with it. But
Yep. But here we are.
Harry did what he was going to do. So,
yep. And then of course, then the Republicans up the ante by doing it for Supreme Court, and there we are. But so any thoughts? I didn't mean to, kind of cut you off on the Bounds thing, which really to me is the least interesting part of it. I mean, I guess it stinks for Ryan Bounds, but I'm okay with that, given that I'm sure he wouldn't exactly have ruled in ways that would have necessarily I would have agreed with. But any thoughts on just that particular element of it, or?
No, my sense from reading this though is that Bounds has really sort of gotten the shaft here from, first of all, the Democrats, and from Tim Scott and Marco Rubio, who kind of stumbled into it and played along with it. The writings that have been described as racially charged, and it's always telling when they don't give you more examples of what those writings were. But for example, he opposed the existence of racially defined organizations on campus. This was back when he was in college. criticized those groups for insulting conservative members of their groups as Oreos or Twinkies. Um, and again, he has been called a bigot for his opposition to bigoted terms and to race-based organizations. Now, I guess again, I haven't read these articles because I tried to find them and I can't. But Omni has apologized for the obnoxious tone, which that sort of goes with the territory of college journalism. And Mike, I'd say if people were to go back and look at stuff you or I might have written in college, I mean, they're sort of there, but for the grace of God go I, right?
Oh, well, especially my stuff. I was just thinking
Yeah.
back to some of the things that I wrote. Sure, but I guess
So I think it's unfair to say that this is, and again also to clarify that the Democrat said, well, these were writings that he hid from them or something like that. He was not asked for writings going back as far as college, which again, if pressed upon to find writings that we did in college, I think that'd be sort of a tough job. But regardless, he had provided them. So I think this is an issue where he got railroaded here. You can, I don't see any reason. Well, again, to me, it's troubling that Scott and Rubio sort of kind of went off and did this without sort of thinking it over.
Well, what some on the left are saying now is that, well, if Republicans, if at least a few Republicans are okay with looking at college writings for bounds, then when we should open up, we want to see all the college writings for Kavanaugh because it's Supreme Court nominee, because that's a much more important judicial confirmation, obviously. And there's been some interesting sort of back and forth thing with basically, I mean, the Republicans obviously want to get Kavanaugh confirmed before the first Monday in October when the Supreme Court meets for its next term. But Mitch McConnell is making some noises saying that, well, if you want to do this whole document dump thing, then maybe we'll just have to push it off until right before the election, which means all you vulnerable Democratic senators, instead of being able to campaign, will have to be in D.C. for the vote and all that sort of thing. So a little bit of that inside baseball stuff going on.
Yeah, well, the other thing is quite honestly, if folks like Rubio or Scott had issues with this beforehand, they could have flagged them earlier, and it could have been brought up earlier in the process rather than we're getting ready for the vote and all of a sudden. So it's to me again one of these can't anyone here play this game?
Right.
If you really did have concerns. You mentioned them quietly to the chairman, who mentions them back to the White House, who then says, who may well ignore them.
Yeah.
And maybe that's the case. But although my sense is from the folks that the judicial nomination shop is sort of running on its own and is probably the most functional.
Yeah. No, good point.
Of the folks we've got working on the White House, but. I think it is unfortunate that that now this is expanded. Are we going to look at high school stuff next?
No, I agree, and it hits both sides. No, I mean, and I think that it's just another example of sort of the hyper partisan polarized nature of these things. And I've been on record a number of times as saying that, and unless somebody is kind of fundamentally judicially unqualified or ethically, morally unqualified, that the president should get his or her nominees, and so anyway. All right. Well, before we go, I want to let everyone know that as soon as Jay and I are done recording this show in a few minutes, we'll be doing our special supporters exclusive show. I think this week there's one thing I wanted to talk about, this new Arizona law talks about what happens when a couple has a dispute over what to do with their jointly created embryo. And it's pretty interesting, as well as President Trump's plans for the next version of Air Force One. It's going to be amazing, obviously. Terrific, right? So anyway, yes. Jay, you might have a few things to add in there as well. So if you're a supporter, all that's going to be waiting for you by the time you hear this. At least it should, if I'm doing my job right. And if you're not a supporter and you'd like to check it out, just go to politicsguys.com/support. That's a direct link. Or you can just go to politicsguys.com and click on support the show or the Patreon or PayPal links there. So that does it, though, for this episode. Thanks, everyone, for listening. We do hope you liked what you heard. And if you could subscribe to the show or share the episodes that would be very helpful. Word of mouth is our best advertising, and leaving reviews and ratings on iTunes also does help. If you want to get in touch with us, mail@politicsguys.com. There's our Facebook page where you can message us and we post stuff throughout the week. That's facebook.com/politicsguys page. And we're also on Twitter @politicsguys. The executive producers of the Politics Guys are Michael Baranowski, Jay Carson, Trey Orndorff, and Bruce Johnson. Today's show was produced by Michael Baranowski. We'll be back with a new show on Wednesday. We hope you'll join us.